Hey everybody, and welcome back to another video. In today's episode, we're going to be creating the dialogue system that you just saw. As you can see, you can have custom events at the start and end of a sentence. You can also have questions and answers with different responses to each question. Of course, this system can get a little bit complicated and difficult to follow, so I'm going to try my best to explain it right now. In just a moment, I will cut back to an empty scene and walk you through creating everything, but just to show you how it works, we have this dialogue trigger here. This dialogue trigger is literally just a cube with a box collider set to be a trigger. When the player enters this cube, we have these dialogue strings and this NPC transform. The player's camera will turn to look at the NPC, and then this dialogue will start to play. Our first one here, it just says hello traveler. When you left click on the mouse, you will then move to the second one. The character says, do you know my name? And we have this little branch, which is tagged with a question. If you click this, you can then have these answer options. So I have yes and no set up. And then, depending on the answer the player gives, you will jump to a different index. Indexes start at 0 on lists, so keep that in mind. As you can see, I have 4 here, but I'm jumping to 3, which is actually representing our last string. So if you click yes, you will jump to option index 2, which is actually this one. And the character says, perfect, I'm glad. And this is tagged as an end. But if you click no, we will move to you have angered me, and this is also an end, but you can see we have this start event. So when the NPC starts to talk, the screen will shake for 2 seconds. This allows you to have loads of different customizability with this. For example, let's say you completed a quest and you come back to talk to the NPC that gave you this quest. At the end of the conversation, you could just come down to this end dialogue event and add a function to give your player a brand new item like a sword or something like a stick. It really just, it's up to you guys, and it's super customizable. This series will take place over 1 to 2 episodes. In this first episode here, we're going to be creating the system that you just saw, and in future episodes we might expand on this system, adding extra ability for more questions and just improving readability. Let me know if you have any requests in the comments, and I will get back to all of you, and let's just jump straight into this. So here we are in our brand new fresh scene. As you can see, the only things I have set up here that you might not is a player controller script and a little model for my King of Sheep. The models just has this log and stump and the King Sheep model, and that is literally everything. So now we're going to set up the actual trigger for these conversations. So the way you're going to want to do this is right click and create a 3D object, and I'm going to make a cube. I'm then going to just drag this in front of my NPC, rotate it to actually line up with the NPC like so, and I'll drop this down, and then click coming over to the left hand side. I'm just going to scale this up to create a proper trigger. What you're then going to want to do is come to your box collider on this cube, and you're going to just click is trigger, and this will stop the player from actually colliding with the box, but instead we can just call some triggered events. And the last thing I'm going to do is just tick off mesh renderer. I'm going to label this as my dialogue trigger, and then I'm going to save my scene here. The next thing you're going to want to do is ensure that your player controller has the player tag. And what this will do is allow us to actually determine if the player has walked into the trigger collider. Now we're going to come down to the bottom here, and we're going to create 2 she subscripts. Our first one is going to be a dialogue trigger, and our second one is going to be a dialogue manager. Once you have these 2 scripts created, on your dialogue trigger, you're going to want to drag on your dialogue trigger script, and on your player controller, you're going to want to drag on your dialogue manager script. So the very last thing that we need to do here is actually create our canvas. So you're going to go ahead and right click on the inspector, go over UI, and then I'm just going to select image. This will create a canvas, image, and an event system. And if you click on game here, you should see this is how your image is looking. I'm going to go ahead and go onto my rect transform component and stretch this by holding Alt on my keyboard and then clicking this button in the corner here, and that will stretch the image across the bottom of the scene. One thing I like to note is that you guys can make this look however you want to fit your game, but I'm going to show you the basic setup that you need to follow in order to make this work. So the first thing I'm going to do is just raise this up a little bit and then make this a bit taller, maybe around 150. I'm then going to go ahead and rename my image, and I'm going to call it a dialogue holder, and I'm going to just make this black for now and a little bit transparent. Once you're done with this, you're then going to right click and add a UI text mesh pro. When you click this, some of you may need to import this package, and it should just be a little pop-up, and you just click import now. After you're done with that, you're then going to want to go to your scene view, 2D, and then tap F while covering your canvas. And this will allow you to actually see what you're doing. The way I want this to work is to stretch across the left-hand side so I have space for my buttons. So what I'm going to do is just click Alt on my keyboard and then click this button here. And then I'm just going to drag this out a bit to around there. I'm then going to scroll down and select center and middle for my alignments here. And you can fill this with some default text. I'm then going to right click and create an empty game object. And I'm going to stretch this same way as before across the right hand side, stretch this out just like so, and then add a grid layout group to this. This is going to have a fixed column count of 1, and this is going to be our button holder. I'm then going to right click on our button holder and create a UI and create a button text mesh pro. And if you look in the game view, this is how it currently looks. I'm making 2 of these. I'm going to make sure to align these under child alignment in the middle center, shrink them down on the Y a little bit so it fits inside of our canvas object, and stretch this along the X. Maybe 250. And I'm also going to add a little bit of a gap on the Y value of around 10, like so. So this is the setup that you need to create in order to have the same system as I have. But of course, now you can fiddle with the UI and other stuff like that. I'm going to cut to when I've fiddled with my UI and made it look like how I want it, and then we can get started with the coding. So now that we're done with this, we can start jumping into the scripts and actually programming some stuff. So the first one I'm going to open is our dialog trigger here, and we're going to set this up. So here we are in our dialog trigger script, and what we're going to do is just delete this / and update, and we're going to come beneath our class here and create a system.serializable, and beneath this we're typing in public class, and we're going to call this class a dialog string. We're going to open this up, and we're going to set up all of our variables here. So this first one is a public string, and this is text, and this will represent the text that the NPC says. Then we're going to create a public bool and call this isEnd, and this will represent if the line is the final line for the conversation that's currently going on. Beneath this, we're just going to create a header, and we will call this header a branch. And opening this up, we're going to create a public bool, and this will be an is question. Beneath this, we're then creating a public string, and this is answer option 1. Control D on the end of this will duplicate, and then this will be answer option 2. We're then going to create 2 public ints beneath this. So the first public int will be called option 1 index, and maybe we'll call this option 1 index jump just to represent that we're jumping to a new index. And again, with a control D, this will be a option 2 index jump integer. Finally, we're creating another header, and this header is going to be called triggered events. And what we're typing in here is public unity event, and we're going to call this a start dialog event. You can see that mine has been auto-corrected to something else. That is because we haven't come up to the very top to our libraries and added a using Unity engine.events, and this will allow us to actually create these public events. And then again, I'm just going to control D to duplicate, and I'm going to call this second one end dialog events. Now coming back up to the top into our dialog trigger class, what we're going to create is a serialized field private list, and this list is going to contain a list of dialog string, and we're going to call this our dialog strings, and we'll equal this to be a new list of dialog string. Beneath this, we're then going to create a private transform. So the way we're going to do this is just type serialized field private transform, and this will be called the NPC transform. And this will allow us to pass in the position of the NPC to our player to actually move the camera towards the NPC that we're talking to. Underneath this, we're just going to create a private boolean, so private bool, and we're just going to type in here has spoken, and we'll equal this to be false for now. In a future episode, we're going to set up some default text that pops up after you've already spoken to the NPC, but for now, we'll just tag it, and this will just turn it off, and the NPC won't talk again. Finally, underneath all of this, we're going to create a private void, and this is going to be an on trigger enter, and you should see it autofills with collider and other. We're then going to type if other dot compare tag, and open this up. We're going to type in here player as a string, and then we're going to type and has spoken, and before has spoken, we're just going to put an exclamation mark because obviously we don't want the NPC to have spoken already. And opening this up one last time, we're just going to write other.gameObject.getComponent, because obviously this is our player component. It has our dialog manager script on it. And then we're just going to type .dialog start. Of course, this function won't exist yet, but we're going to pass in our dialog list, or our dialog strings rather, and then comma, we're passing in NPC transform. We'll create this dialog start in just a moment, but finally on this script, we're just going to write has spoken is now equal to true, because the NPC has now started speaking. We're going to come back to our scene here, and we're going to pop into our dialog manager script, and we're going to start setting this up as well. So here we are in our dialog manager, and the very first thing that we're going to do in this script is come up to our top, and we're going to import a few new libraries. So this first one is going to be using Unity Engine.ui. The second one is going to be using Unity Engine.events, and this last one will be using TM Pro. So Unity Engine.ui we'll be using for our buttons, Unity Engine.events we'll be using for our event system, As you can see here, we have these two Unity events that we need to be calling. And finally, TM Pro is just to allow us to type with our dialog and adjust our UI buttons text. We're then going to come up into our class here, and we're going to delete these two functions, the void start and update. And we're going to create a serialized field, and this is going to be a private game object, and we'll call this our dialog parent. I'm just going to copy serialized field and private here, just to save me the time. The second one is going to be a tmp underscore text, and this is our dialog text. We're then going to create two buttons. So what I'm going to type is serialized field, private button, and this is our option 1 button. We're then going to control D to duplicate, and this is our option 2 button. We're then going to create two floats, so serialized field, private float, and this is our typing speed. And we'll equal this to be 0.05f, which means every 0.05 seconds, we will type a new character. Our second float is going to be serialized field, private float, and this will be our turning speed. And we're just going to type turn speed for that. And we'll default this to be maybe 2. And this just represents how quickly we turn towards the NPC. Finally, we're going to create a private list without serializing this field because we don't need to see it. And this will be a dialog string. And we'll call this our dialog list. So we're almost done with our variables here, but there's one thing that we need to do, and that is create a new header. And this is just going to be our player. So I like to have it so when we are interacting with an NPC, the player cannot move around and turn the camera and stuff like that. So what I want you guys to do is create a reference to your player. I'll do the same thing. The way that we actually go about enabling and disabling this player controller will be very similar. So I've gone ahead and just created a reference to my player controller. As you can see, it's a pretty out there player controller I got from an asset pack. But I've just gone ahead and labeled this as our first person controller, and you guys can do the same, and that way we'll just have the same actual code. There's another thing, and that is to create a private transform, and this will be our player camera. And at the very, very bottom here, we're just creating a private int, and this is our current dialog index, and we'll equal this to be 0 by default. That is absolutely everything for our variables here. Obviously, yours will be looking a little bit different with your first-person controller. And of course, if you do need help with your first-person controller and accessing it, I am more than happy to help. Just leave a comment. We'll now be moving on to the actual coding part. So the first thing we're going to do is create a private void, and this will just be a start. And within this, we're just going to make sure that our dialog parent is active. So we're doing dialog parent.setActive false, and this will just hide our dialog by default. And finally, we're just going to type in player camera is equal to camera.main.transform, and this will allow us to actually access our camera and turn it towards the NPC. Beneath this, we're then going to create a public void, and this will be our dialog start. And as you can see on our triggered event here, we have this dialog start, and it's passing in these dialog strings and this NPC transform. So we need to make sure that we are taking in those as well. So we're going to type in a list of dialog strings, and we'll call this our text print. And then we'll do a comma and just do transform, and we'll call this our NPC. Opening this up here, we can now see that we have created our function. On our dialog trigger, we no longer get that squiggly line, and we can go ahead and fill this in with some code. So the first thing we're going to do is just copy this dialog parent.setActive false, and we're just going to put true in here, and this will enable it when we start talking to an NPC. We're then going to just do first person controller dot enabled is equal to false, and this will disable the player controller. We're then going to just do something called cursor.lockState, and we'll equal this to cursor lock mode none, allowing us to move our cursor around. And I'm going to go ahead and type beneath this cursor.visible is equal to true. This will allow us to actually move our cursor around when we're talking to an NPC and click on certain things. However, one thing I'd like to note is that quite often a first-person controller will try and override this, which is why we're making sure to enable it to be false before our cursors. If your cursor doesn't become visible when the NPC has started talking, there may be something else overriding it. So you're just going to want to make sure that you disable that before you start dialog text. For me, obviously, this is fine, so I'm going to go ahead and move on, and I'm going to start a coroutine and open these brackets, and this coroutine is going to be called turn camera towards NPC. This coroutine doesn't exist yet, so we won't do this just yet. We're going to come beneath this and type dialog list is equal to text to print. Then we're just going to do current dialog index is equal to 0. We're going to call a function called disable buttons, and finally we're going to start a brand new coroutine and call this print dialog. Obviously we have a lot of functions that we're calling here, And the first one I'm going to start with is disable buttons. I'm going to come underneath this and create a private void, and of course call this disable buttons. And what we're going to do in here is actually just make sure that our buttons are not interactable. So to do this, we're just going to type option1 button dot interactable is equal to false. We'll duplicate this and then just change this to be option2 button dot interactable equals false. And then we're going to write a fairly long line, which is option1 button dot get component in children. Then we're just typing in PMP underscore text, open close brackets, dot text is equal to no option. I'm going to duplicate this again and just do the same thing for our option2 button. And this will just default our text to be no option when we cannot interact with the buttons. Now we're going to move on to our turn camera towards NPC function. So what we're going to do here is come beneath our disable buttons function, and we're going to create a private. And this is a IE numerator, as you can see, because we are starting a coroutine, and we'll call this turn camera towards NPC. And of course, this takes in a transform called NPC. Opening this up, we're just going to write quaternion, and this will be our start rotation, and we'll equal this to be player camera dot rotation. Then we're going to create a second quaternion. So this is going to be our target rotation, and we will equal this to be quaternion dot look rotation, open brackets, NPC dot position minus player camera dot position. So now we have our start and target rotations that we're trying to achieve. So what we're going to do is create a float and call this elapsed time, equal this to be 0, and then we're going to create a while loop. So while elapsed time is smaller than 1, we will then go ahead and type player camera dot rotation equals quaternion dot slurp, open brackets, start rotation, target rotation, and elapsed time. Beneath this, we're just going to go elapsed time plus equals time dot delta time, and then we'll times this by our turn speed variable that we created. And finally, we're just going to write yield return null. And beneath this while loop, the final thing we're going to write is player camera dot rotation is equal to target rotation, just to ensure that we've made it the entire way when we have exited our elapsed time function here. One thing I actually forgot to do is pass in our NPC as the transform that we're looking at in our turn camera towards NPC routine. And now we're done. So now we're going to move on to our print dialog function. And the way we're going to do this is create a private IE numerator. And this is, of course, our print dialog. We're just going to do a second while loop, and we're going to type in here current dialog index is smaller than dialog list dot count. Then we're just going to write dialog string, and we'll call this line is equal to dialog list, open square brackets, current dialog index, like so. This is going to get the line that we're currently trying to write. We're then just going to write an if statement. So if line dot is question, and we can open this up. And beneath this, we're just going to write an else. So in the situation where the line is not a question, all we're going to do is call a function. So yield return start coroutine. And it's going to be our type text coroutine. And we're just going to pass in line.text. One thing I actually forgot to do is if above your if line is question, you're going to write line.start dialog events question mark dot invoke. And this will actually just invoke the dialog events that you wanted to happen at the start of your line. We can go ahead and actually copy this, and underneath our else function, we can trigger our end dialog events. So now we're going to set up this if line is a question. So the first thing we're going to do is come ahead and copy our yield return start coroutine type text, and we'll paste this here. And then what we're going to do beneath this is actually come up to our disable buttons function, and we're just going to go ahead and copy this. But we're going to flip everything. So option1 button dot interactable is equal to true, same for option 2. And for our text here, what we're doing is line dot answer option 1, and for our option 2 text, this will just be, of course, line dot answer option 2. Now, one last thing we're going to do here is create some onClick events. So what we're typing in is option 1 button dot onClick dot add listener, open close brackets. Then we're going to do that again is equal, and then a greater than symbol to handle option selected, which is again a function we haven't created. So we're typing in handle option selected, and within this we're just going to write line dot option 1 index jump. I'm going to zoom in here so you guys can make sure that you've copied this exactly how I have. This second one will be in option 2 button, of course, and we're just going to pass in option 2 index jump in this situation. Finally, we're just going to write beneath this yield return new, wait until, open close brackets again, and then the equals and greater than symbol. And finally, option selected. Option selected is a Boolean, which doesn't exist just yet. So what I'm going to do is come above our print dialog function and create a private bool option selected. and make sure that we default this to be false. And finally, the last thing we're going to do is come beneath this and just type option selected is equal to false. And outside of our while loop, we're just going to write dialog stop. So now, as you can see, we have 3 more functions to go. And the first one we're probably going to do is our handle option selected. So to do this, we're just going to create a private void handle option selected. And this will take in an int called index jump. This is a super short function. So what we're doing here is option selected. And we'll equal this to be false. And we're just going to do disable buttons. And finally, current dialog index is equal to index jump, which is the variable we just passed in. That's everything for our handle option selected function. What we're going to do beneath this is create our type text function. So we're typing in private enumerator, type text, open brackets, and this will take in a string called text. We can now open this up. Inside of here, we're just going to write dialog text dot text is equal to nothing. Just set it to be nothing for now. Then we're going to do a for each loop, and within this, we're going to type char, and we'll call this letter in text dot toChar array. This just creates an array of all the characters in the text. And after this, we're just going to write dialog text dot text plus equals letter, like so. Underneath this, we're going to write yield return new wait for seconds. And then we're typing in typing speed for our wait for seconds variable. We're then going to do a if statement underneath our for each. If exclamation mark dialog list open square brackets, and within these square brackets we're just going to write current dialog index, and finally dot is question. So if the current dialog index that we're looking at isn't a question, we will then do a yield return new wait until open brackets open close brackets is equal to and a greater than symbol, and then we're just going to type in here input dot get mouse button down, and we'll pass in 0. So what this is doing is it's going to wait until the player left clicks, and when the player left clicks, the new text will actually pop up. But of course, we only want to do this if the button or if the current text is a question. If it's not a question, obviously we want to just wait until we have clicked either of our buttons here. So that's why we're doing it inside of this if statement. Then what you're going to want to do beneath this is type another if, and this will be dialog list open and close square brackets, and we're typing in current dialog index. And then finally, this is going to be if it's an end function, and in this case, we will just call a dialog stop function. Our dialog stop is one of the last lines that we haven't created yet. I apologize, I actually forgot to make this a capital T. So our dialog stop is the last function we haven't created yet, but before we can move on to make that, we're just going to create a final line, which is current dialog index plus plus, and this will just increment our current dialog index. So now, of course, the last function that we haven't created is our dialog stop. And to do this, at the very bottom of our script here, we're going to create a private void. And this is, of course, our dialog stop function. And what we're doing in here is we're going to call a stop all coroutines, open close bracket like so, and that will stop all the text from typing. Then we're going to do dialog text dot text is equal to nothing, just to reset that. Dialog parent dot set active false, just to hide that from the player. And the very last thing we're going to want to do is just re-enable our player. So what I'm going to do is just scroll up to where we were disabling everything, copy these lines, and first person controller dot enabled is equal to true. Cursor dot lock state equals cursor dot lock mode dot locked, and cursor dot visible is equal to false. And that is everything for our dialog manager so far. We can now head back to our scene here and set everything else up. So here we are now finally back in our scene after a good bit of code. You can see we have our dialog manager and it's now full of a bunch of stuff. The first thing I'm going to do is pull my first person controller into my first person controller section. Our dialog parent is inside of our canvas, and you can see that's called a dialog holder for us. We then have our dialog text, our option button 1 and option button 2. Our typing speed and our turn speed are already set up, so we don't need to touch those. And we can move on to actually setting up our text. So if I go to my dialog trigger, which is of course this little box we have here, we now have this NPC transform variable and these dialog strings. First thing I'm going to do is pull my king sheep as the NPC transform, because of course this is the little guy we're trying to talk to. And within these dialog strings, we're just going to add, and we can pop this open to see how this works. So I'm going to try and walk you guys through this system as quickly as I possibly can, just to save a bit of time here. Obviously, text here represents what our NPC is going to say. So let's say his first line is hello with an exclamation mark. This is not the end of the conversation, nor is it a question. So what we can do is move on to our next element, because we are incrementing from one to the other, unless of course this is a question, in which case we use our index jumps. So let's say the follow-up to hello is a question, and our sheep is asking how we are. We can tag this with an isQuestion boolean and add our answers here. So our player can respond with I'm good, or our player could respond with I hate you, king sheep, just to make it a bit more interesting. So obviously we need to have two responses to either of these answers. So we'll add a new one and just make sure to remove this question and these two answers. And then we'll create two of these like so. If, for example, our player chooses to say I'm good, the sheep might respond with that's great to hear. We can tag this as the end of the conversation because we want that to be the final line the sheep says. However, if we say I hate you, king sheep, let's instead say what? And this won't be the end of the conversation because we want to follow it up with something else, but I do want to add a triggered event. So I'm going to click plus, drag onto my main camera, and I'm going to add some screen shake. You guys can find loads of screen shake scripts. This is not what this tutorial is about, so I won't show you that. And we'll follow this up with another line here, and the sheep will say, get lost, exclamation mark. And this would be the end of the conversation. Now that we have our responses set up, we need to set up our index jumps. So starting from 0, we have hello, which is 0, how are you, which is 1, that's great to hear, which is 2. So if we say I'm good, we're jumping to 2. However, if we say I hate you, king sheep, we want to jump to 3. It's important to remember that obviously these elements start at 0. So we have 0, 1, 2, 3, and 4 instead of 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. If we now go ahead and click play here, and we walk up to our sheep, you can see that we start the conversation. So the sheep says hello, how are you? And we can respond with I hate you, king sheep. We get a bit of screen shake and the sheep goes, what? Get lost. And just like that, the conversation is over. I hope you guys have enjoyed this video. If you have, please do remember to subscribe and hit the like. I also have a buy me a coffee link in the description if you want to support the channel with your own donations, as well as a TikTok account, which is linked below if you want to check that out. Thank you very much for watching, and I'll see you all very soon.